Sound is very good. So I'm Jessica Einhorn. I'm the Dean of Science, and I'm just delighted to welcome all of you to this very special event, honoring, but also hearing from Dr. Matthias Matthijs, the 5th recipient of the Max M. Fisher Prize for Excellence in Teaching. This prize has been funded by the Marjorie S. Fisher Fund of the Community Foundation of Southeastern Michigan. The Max Fisher Excellence in Teaching Prize is awarded each year at commencement. And I have to say, it's the most exciting moment in commencement, and it's such a gratifying time, to one of the science professors on the Washington campus and is selected by the graduating class. SAIS is a world-renowned institution, as you, our students, know, and hopefully our friends and partners here know too. And we owe that in large part to the dedication and quality of our faculty. This year's recipient embodies that tradition of excellence and of a curiosity that encompasses scholarly pursuits to better understand and then improve the world of policy and practice. Professor Matthijs completed both his MA and PhD degrees at SAIS, so I've seen him grow up, and currently serves as a professorial lecturer of international economics and international relations. He specializes, as many of you know, in the politics of the economic crisis and the role of economic ideas in policymaking. While his focus has been on Western Europe, and presumably will stay somewhat there, and North America, his current research is moving to Asia. And this January, he will lead a really lucky group of students on a trip to Southeast Asia in an effort to better understand the changing security, political, cultural, and economic links between that region and the West. He has that custom of bringing students along as he learns, and everybody seems to benefit from that. The students who voted for him have some of the best testimonials to share about his skills as both an educator and mentor. So says one student, Dr. Matthias was an outstanding professor. His teaching illuminates the nuances of economics and helps students make sense of complicated subjects, all with a sense of humor. Econ, quote, ceased to be boring and actually became kind of fun. Says another, he's a skilled teacher, a fine orator, and a supportive mentor. Suffice it to say, I would not have survived SAIS without this clear explanation and enthusiasm for teaching international economics. He is the paragon of teaching excellence and is most deserving of this award. Yeah, I think we've all had enough, so I'll stop with 2. It is for this excellence as a teacher that we honor him this evening. But before I invite him to the podium, I want to tell you just a little bit more about this prestigious award. The award is distinctive because it is selected solely by the students. The Fisher Prize was established in 2007 by the family of Max M. Fisher as a tribute to his life and his abiding interests in international affairs. He was former chairman of something called Aurora Gasoline Incorporated, and he was a dedicated advocate, actually, for the Jewish community and for his hometown of Detroit. He served as an advisor to Republican presidents from Dwight Eisenhower to George Herbert Walker Bush, and as an unofficial ambassador between the United States and Israel. In Middle Eastern affairs, his daughter, Israel and Middle Eastern affairs. His daughter, Marjorie Fisher, whom I know and enjoy, is a trustee of Johns Hopkins University. Unfortunately, the Fisher family could not be with us tonight, but on behalf of the entire SAIS community, I take the liberty of thanking them for their dedication to scholarship and their passion for academic excellence. A round of applause. And now to this evening's treat. We are privileged to have as a part of our community at SAIS, Matthias. Please join me in congratulating him as the 2011 recipient of the Max Fisher Award, and let's bring him to the podium. Thank you.
Wow. I'm not a big fan of those praise things. We don't really tend to do that much, as our European friends will know. So, I mean, I'm glad we can get to the serious part of the evening. But first of all, thank you all so much for coming. I was thinking of who to thank, and I want to do this very briefly for this lecture. And I think I want to particularly thank my own teachers in this. In particular, here, I guess who's influenced the most and who's influenced me the most in my teaching and intellectually have been David Kaleo here tonight at SAIS, and obviously also Mark Blythe at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, now at Brown University. But there's been many others. I do want to honor the memory of Enzo Grilli, who I was his student, and he was a phenomenal economics professor. I mean, talking about sense of humor and an Italian passion that he could bring to the classroom. But many others here also, and I do want to thank the economics department and the international relations department here. I continue to learn from my colleagues in the economics department, Pravin Krishna, Guru Setupati, Leo Feller, Mine Senses, Gordon Bodner. I'm not naming all of them, but they're all very good, and it's a stimulating place to work. But of course, what makes SAIS such a fantastic place to work and teach is the students. So thank you. Most of you are students here for presenting me with this award, at least last year. The inspiration for this lecture, though, came from Tony Judd. Tony Judd was a historian, a European expert at New York University who passed away from a terrible disease way too early. And I kind of want to dedicate this to him because this is just the kind of time his analysis would have been very good. So this is for Judd. So in thinking about this lecture, I was like, well, I have to do something on crisis. Because when I started thinking about a doctoral topic in 2004, I wanted to do something with crises and narration of this and all that kind of stuff. And most people were telling me, but this is kind of done. I mean, economic crises, that's so 1980s or 1990s. We've kind of cracked this thing. So you struggle through the difficult years of a doctoral dissertation where people kind of warning you, you're writing about the Soviet Union in 1987 or something like that. And so now every time I start an introduction, I say, well, I'm in the crisis business, and business is good. And it remains to be very good. So in thinking about this lecture, of course, most of us live in Washington, D.C., and we're kind of obsessed with technical solutions to what we see as technical problems, right? A euro bond for the eurozone, or a quick tax increase for the United States, or a cut in defense spending, and all will be well. But as I was thinking more and more about what we've seen the last 5 years globally in the United States and as well as in Europe, I was thinking, well, there's a much bigger story there, and it's that story that I want to try to tell. Or explain tonight. After all, I am a political economist, and that's supposedly what we should do well, right? Explain those moments when economists can't always explain what is going on. So what do I want to do tonight? Briefly, and I hope to end maybe in like 35 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can have some questions and answers. I want to start with the idea of economic crisis and uncertainty, and especially confusion, right? We have causes of the crisis, we have the trigger, and we have the consequence. And we tend to confuse the three of them, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then I want to focus on what I think has been the underlying cause of all of this, but has been only really stressed at the global level. And that's the idea of imbalances. So I want to focus at three levels: the domestic level, the structural level, structural international, and the ideational global level. And then to illustrate these three kinds of imbalances, I look at three cases that correlate to this. So the United States to explain the domestic imbalance, the eurozone to explain the international structural imbalance, and then looking ahead at Friday, I guess, when the G20, or Thursday already, when the G20 meets in Cannes in the south of France, at the imbalances that we've seen at the level of the global economy. I do want to then spend a little bit of time on the politics of imbalances, because it seems to me that is the dimension which is not always stressed, and the power of ideas, and then in true Tony Judd style, try to draw some lessons from history, and then conclude with the interesting idea. It's a book by Sherry Berman at Barnard College, but that in good times it's the primacy of economics, and in bad times somehow the primacy of politics tends to take over and people look towards the government for solutions. So the first idea, the crisis and confusion. Basically, I think you all, I mean, this is the Beltway after all. You know by now the main different causes of the crisis. So pick your favorite explanation from this if you want. Many people prefer to blame it all on populist credit expansion, subprime lending, the government getting the incentives wrong for the private sector. A lot of people, both on the left and the right, blame the central bank, the Federal Reserve these days, for too lax a monetary policy. Many people have looked at distorted incentives for financial institutions and banks, regulators, as well as households. People like Martin Wolf have focused on global macroeconomic imbalances, but basically the last two, that's kind of what it sums up. Pick your preference on the political spectrum, and where you stand will basically say, well, it's a market failure versus a government failure. But I think both, we can have this debate, but both are kind of have been at the heart of this crisis. So the trigger was the banks, not the cause, right? It's often gotten wrong. I mean, banks have been blamed for being greedy forever, right? They respond to incentives, as most of you studying economics know. I don't have to go over this again. The financial crisis was caused by the subprime trigger. And subprime lending and debt securitization were merely symptoms in that sense of a broader problem. But we've been too fixated, I think, so far on the trigger, on the idea of financial market instability. Well, I will argue tonight, not exclusively, but I will kind of try to make the point that we should focus on the underlying imbalances that got us here and basically now impede a much more rapid recovery. And I'll get to that in the next point. The consequences, so we had causes, we had the trigger, the banks, the subprime lending bubble that burst. The consequences, of course, you all know. We've seen slower growth, rising unemployment, increasing poverty levels, and the loss of many middle-class savings, right, from 401k to 201k or something like that. And then the financial economy, we've seen over-levered consumer sectors and banks being very reluctant to lend. But the main consequence, which everybody focuses on now, is this sovereign debt crisis and democratic paralysis regarding the optimal response, right? The idea of austerity versus more stimulus, which is at the heart still of all the economic debates today. But interestingly enough, and I cannot stress this enough, the sovereign debt crisis was the consequence of the financial crisis, not its cause. So the solution now to focus on cutting government spending or increasing taxes or getting rid of the deficit seems to me to only deal with the consequence rather than with the underlying causes. So, next point. Trying to think of what kind of imbalances they are, I think most people are familiar with the global the macroeconomic imbalances of the trade balance and the imbalance of savings and investment. So I try to come up with political scientists like topologies, right? We put things in a box and that way we understand it better. And everything else we can't explain that, it's all in there that matters. So here is the idea and the kind of overall binding idea for this lecture is that there's imbalances at three levels. We have them domestic and what I call domestic political in that category. What you could now call the limits of democratic politics, the way we see it in the United States. Polarization, that the ones that scream the loudest on each part of the political spectrum seem to dominate the agenda. An old idea, for those of you who know the literature, I'm not going to talk about it too much, don't worry, but Charles Lindblom already wrote this in 1982, the idea of the market as prison, right? That we, since the early 80s, always have to do what's good for the market, what's good for business, and that we kind of forgotten about a careful balancing act that we've had ever since World War II. And then also what we've seen is the erosion of the welfare state, right? Everybody now talks about entitlements, while everybody pays payroll taxes, and these supposedly are rights, things you're paying into, right? But talking about entitlements already makes it seem somehow wrong. And that whole debate has shifted. I think the second level is more familiar to most observers of the political economy, and those are the structural and international imbalances. So the global and local macroeconomic imbalances, and I'll talk about the local part in respect to the eurozone. And then also what you could call excess specialization, right? I mean, I'm a bad one to talk, teaching international trade and telling everybody that you should specialize in what you're good at, and that's all fine. But I think this has gone too far in certain economies. This is not my idea. The new monocrop economies is something that Martin Wolf launched in the Financial Times. The idea that if you specialize too much, let's say in finance, and there's a financial crisis, your whole economy gets dragged down. And that we kind of have to have some kind of rebalancing there, but I will illustrate that in my 3 cases. And then the last one, the ideational global dimension, I guess is the first what I would call neoliberal ideology as religion, right? And I'll give you a small anecdote when I get to this, but it's interesting how the West has kind of gotten stuck in a certain way that we think the world works. The second one, favored in Washington and Brussels, the eternal belief in technocratic fixes to what we see as technical problems. And then the last part for the international relations majors is the kind of tension between hegemonic stability, the United States having controlled the world economy for so long, and that we're now kind of back in this balance of power politics. So, next point to my cases. Let's start at home with the United States. So, and these are figures I think you've read over and over again, but it's never a bad idea to look at them. The 1% versus the 99%, right? Average household income, we've seen it evolve on the left graph. I mean, it clearly illustrates the 1% versus the rest. Even the top 20%, that's the yellow line below, wasn't all that impressive a growth. And this starts the year I was born in 1979. And then average income, including capital gains, you see an even more extreme example. The top 1% now at an average income of well over $1 million. And this is data from the US Census Bureau. This is what we've seen much more recently in the last 10 years. Median US household income, so the middle person of the United States, makes about just below $50,000 a year. And then on the right-hand side, Americans living in poverty. I mean, the great boom, supposedly, from 2003 to 2007 should have gotten those levels down, you would have thought. And you see a little bit of a falling off after 2003. But you see in the last couple of years how we've basically gone from 31 million people living in poverty, so below half the median wage, below half the median wage. And then 46 million now living in poverty. I believe it's defined that for an individual it's making below 12,000 a year. For a family of 4, it's below 22,000 a year. I mean, 22,000 is a PhD stipend at size. So, I mean, that's for 4, and that's where. So, I mean, we're above the poverty line. That's good to know. This here is a very interesting graph because it shows you the United States from 1910 to 2010, and it shows you wages in the financial sector. Yeah, one big omission in my thank yous is all these beautiful graphs, not my work. I have Neil Chennai to thank for this, and I should have mentioned him in the very beginning. I tell him what I want, and he gives it. He kind of delivers this. So Neil, thank you for coming up with these things. So this shows that wages in the financial sector having, basically they were very high, right, in the teens and the 20s that we all know, and then became a lot lower, but then started to go up again. What the correlation here is the relative levels of education. So a colleague of mine at Harvard Business School, Rawi Abdelal, kind of pointed this out, that 2008, May 2008 was the year that the highest percentage of Harvard Business School graduates went to Wall Street, bar 1 year, and that was 1929. So this is kind of linking this idea that the more resources we put in finance, obviously educationally, the more of the best and the brightest go into finance. We shouldn't be surprised. But it also seems to have a very high correlation with how big the upswings and the downswings are. So you really see here is the kind of era of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that finance wasn't the main preoccupation of our policymakers when it was into getting people into a good education. Unemployment, that's a graph you all know. I mean, and this is important, right? Especially me coming from Europe. This is a tough country. This is a tough country when you don't have a job. I can't imagine not having a job in this country. So in that sense here, America has gotten used to an unemployment rate around 5%, a little bit above, a little bit below, a little bit below. And that's for basically from 95, I think, pretty much up until 2008. And there's been this bump up now where we, hovering just below 10%. And I mean, most of the unemployment that America has had above 9% have been under this presidency. And it's going to hurt him next year tremendously. The other figure, the U6, that's the ILO compliant figure, which includes things like you're forced to work part-time or you basically dropped out of the labor force. And that's closer to 20%. And 20% becomes a more serious number, right? The United States has also seen falling savings and debt-fueled consumption, right? So on the red graph is the personal savings, which in the early 80s was still above 10% on average, and then got very close to zero on average by 2005. And then obviously we've seen the reversal since 2008. Personal consumption expenditures have consistently grown ever since the 1980s. A small dip in 91 in the recession, early 90s, but then has grown consistently, grown faster than the overall growth of the economy, hence fueling this bubble. And then, so now we've seen, of course, the last 3 years, the kind of deleveraging cycle, which keeps us in this kind of depressed state. This is one of my favorite graphs also because it kind of makes the point that it's all Greenspan and Bernanke's fault, right? The blue graph, the blue line is the federal funds rate and the red line is the Case-Shiller home price index. So you see that for most of the 90s, and this could actually have gone back to 1990, and it would have stayed anywhere between 70 and 80, this index. And it really was kind of in the late 90s it started to take off, but it really took off when you see the federal funds rate staying, what people now say, too low for too long, right? So the main boom in housing prices was when you had this period of 2003, 2004, when these rates were at, ridiculously, you could now say low, 1%. But then the belief was we don't need to burst bubbles. So that's what we've been doing, right? QE1, QE2, the Bernanke twist. I was always hoping that they're doing press conferences now, that he actually was going to do a twist or something. Talk about QE3. So basically, what does this mean? And I think this is often forgotten, and especially for those of you who are studying macroeconomics, you know how the money supply in the long term is related to inflation. This is what's happened with the Federal Reserve. It became a bad bank. 800 billion is the kind of base you see for 2007, 2008. That's the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. And literally, the moment it starts to shoot up is September 2008, right? And you could say, sure, but there was a crisis. We put in liquidity. That's what we needed to do. And you could say, fine, okay. It stayed that way, though. We're still there. Here, the blue stuff, that's the good stuff. Those are government bonds, right? The red stuff at the end, these are things called agency debt and MBS. Remember MBS? Mortgage-backed securities. That's what the Federal Reserve is holding up until today. It's not just 10% or 20% of the balance sheet. It's a majority of the balance sheet. So the question now is, and I guess monetarists and Austrian school economists really worry about is, how are we going to wind down this debt? And what moment are you going to try to get the money supply down? But I think this is kind of a phenomenal. I mean, any good Austrian economist would worry about this amount of money being in the economy. But then, as most of you know, they're in the banks, and the banks aren't lending. So in that sense, if nothing's moving, supposedly there's no inflationary danger. More than anything, people still worry about deflation in today's US economy. And then here, from monetary policy to fiscal policy, our favorite example of rising budget deficits. Right here, note the red line, the receipts. That's an all-time low. 14% of GDP are tax receipts, tax intake. Right? To now use the 999 rule, or Paris having 20% flat tax, seems to me to get that even further down. Right? Especially at a time that you need more public investment. So we kind of have, as you see now, a very structural deficit of high spending and very low revenue. But remember, and I think that's what's often forgotten, remember where all this debt came from. The blue half is about half of the new debt. So you see the IMF Fiscal Monitor, 39.1% average debt increase that we've seen over OECD countries. Half of it is revenue loss because of the recession, right? It's basically the taxes you're no longer getting. The stimulus, which is often blamed for all evil in the world, is only really 4.5% extra debt. I mean, that's something that's cyclical, that's normal. And the financial sector support, also a favorite culprit, basically is not that big either. And then, of course, you have the interest growth dynamics, which make up the rest. So basically what we've seen is this is a phenomenon of imbalances that has been underway a lot longer. It's always a good day to talk about the eurozone, especially today. This is one of my favorite pictures as far as these things go. So you know the three main players there, Papandreou on the left, Sarkozy in the middle, and Merkel on the right. This could have all been taken today, this picture. You didn't tell me you were going to call a referendum. And that's exactly what they did. Yeah, so now what? Okay. Let's not focus on the daily news, especially not on the markets, but let's focus on the longer-term trends that we've seen in the eurozone. So this is the graph you see everywhere as a beginning of talking about the eurozone crisis, the rising bond spreads, right? I should have basically gone back a little bit earlier, because what you see at the end, you basically saw at the beginning of the 1990s, right, as convergence started. And of course, the green one is Greece, and then below it you have the other culprits, Ireland, I guess, Spain, and Portugal are the highest, and the lowest obviously being Germany. My good friend at the Institute of International Economics, Jacob Kierkegaard, calls this the new normal. He's like, it should have been this way always, right? This whole idea of convergence, basically from 2001 all the way to 2008, that was always a hoax in many ways. I mean, but why did we believe this? I mean, Greece is a very different place to invest in government bonds than Germany. Nonetheless, financial market participants did believe in this, right? And it's now really that they're worried again. I mean, the one thing here, I guess Italy is, yeah, here it's close. Today it was at its highest rate in the last 10 years, at 6.18%, right? So people are worried there, especially the Italian economy, because it's such a big economy and hence a lot of debt. This is the main explanation. You read it everywhere. It's the favorite German explanation of everything. It's all bad public finances, right, that caused this. And I mean, obviously, if you look at the annual growth of government expenditures, there's something to this picture. Ireland, you see the growth of government expenditure over the last 10 years, from 97 to 2007 when the problems really started, of over 10% a year, way beyond the growth. The same for Spain, Greece, and Portugal. And of course, the frugal Germans have been much better at this. But I mean, I never want to say that public finances are not part of the picture. I just think it's only really the story for Greece and not for the rest. Another favorite explanation is Europe's eroding competitiveness, especially compared to Germany. Here you see unit labor costs, the change between 2000 and 2007. Irish wages having gone up with 27% over that period. Of course, what you don't see here, from 2008 to 2010, they went down with 25%. They actually did take the cut. Maybe this is a good time to kind of go after Irish academics. I don't know. And they're definitely on the market. But we've seen unit labor costs. I mean, it's not a surprise that who is there? Who are all the ones up front? Ireland, Spain, Italy, Greece, Cyprus and Malta, and Portugal. The other countries have had more moderate wage increases. But that's not the whole story either. This is another example of wage growth. There you really see the Greek example. They had a huge catching up movement from 85 to 94, but then the growth has been a lot higher. The only country that's seen, of course, negative wage growth is the Germans. You see it very, very clearly. This is the more important story, I think, is the current account imbalances, right? Here you clearly see Germany. And what are current account imbalances? Well, obviously, the biggest chunk is the trade balance, exports minus imports. So the Germans have been exporting like there was no tomorrow. Current account balances as a percent of GDP for Germany peaked well over 7%